No, go on in. There's food in that room if you guys would like
The spiritual belief that I practice, that I come from, teaches us that when we speak, we're always speaking on behalf of our ancestors, and more than likely they are speaking through us. So I always take an opportunity to thank my ancestors, both my Native American indigenous ancestors and my African indigenous ancestors. So I want to start by saying that. Second of all, I want to thank you all for taking the time out of what I know are your busy lives. I know the majority of you are in the middle of finals and paper writing and, school-related chaos. So thank you again for coming out and hearing what I have to share with you this evening. Okay? So I guess I should start by talking a little bit about what my background is and then going on from there. So I embarked on a journey about 6 months ago. I left Alabama. Actually, I left Florida, but I'm from Alabama. I left Florida about 6 months ago, drove out here over a 6-week period of time. And in this journey, I decided that I needed to that a lot of the anxiety that I was experiencing but could not pinpoint was because of this disconnect that I had with nature. So I told my mom, I was like, look, I'm going to camp the whole way. I'm going to bypass the hotels, and I'm just going to camp. She was like, girl, you ain't been camping a day in your damn life. I was like, it's all right. I can work it out. So I bought some camping gear. I bought a machete and a hunting knife and a lantern and hit the road. And ever since I left Florida, that was in June, every single day has been literally amazing. I did the trip over 6 weeks. I stayed on 2 Native American reservations. I stayed on the Taos Pueblo Res for a week in Taos, New Mexico. And then I stayed on the White Mountains Apache Res for 2 weeks in southern Arizona. And then I came here. Subsequent to that, I've camped on Morongo Res. And so anyway, I started with that. That's not my start, obviously, but it's been the most pivotal point of what has been an incredible journey for me. I've been a political activist now since I was about 16 years old. Held the first Earth Day events at my high school, which was population 3,000, Abbeville, Alabama. My graduating high school class was 24 whole people. And so that was like a renegade thing to do, was to have an Earth Day event in Abbeville, Alabama. And held the first anti-Gulf War Gulf War demonstration in Abbeville. That was interesting. But anyway, so there have been these changes that eventually led to my life as a committed activist. And that started in Florida. I moved to Florida when I was 24 years old and started working with this relatively militant organization called the Uhuru Movement, and they had 2 nonprofit organizations. One was the African People's Education and Defense Fund, and the other was the All African People's Development and Empowerment Project, which was our On the Continent Africa program. I'm starting with this because it too will go into this conversation that we're going to have about food sovereignty and wellness. So in the African People's Education and Defense Fund, I was the wellness coordinator. We had a gym and a wellness center and a health food store in the middle of the most impoverished community in South St. Pete. The unemployment rate was one of the highest in the country in this area, in this city. And this city is still considered one of the top 10 most segregated cities in the country. So literally there are places in Southside St. Pete that look like Fallujah. I mean, the poverty is just striking. And so what we decided was that this particular nonprofit organization called the African People's Education and Defense Fund. Its primary purpose was to address disparities in health and education in the African community and the Black community in this country. So we had the health food store, which was a hard sell in an impoverished community, but we also understood the question of food deserts. We understood the question of what we called the trickle down effect. That what most of us assume is like general information about health, wellness, how to take care of yourself, has this very slow trickle down effect to poor and working class communities. What we take as general information, most people who are pit with the day-to-day struggles of providing the bare necessities, food, clothing, and shelter, are not aware of this information. So what we did was we had a free monthly seminar that we distributed to the community, and we did that like straight scorched earth, door to door, knocking on people's door, giving them the newsletter, talking to them about the newsletter, and then also we did free monthly seminars and wellness checks. So we had a relationship with the local health departments who had nurses that would come and do like blood sugar checks, blood pressure checks. We had another representative from the health department that would do free HIV and AIDS tests for the community. And then I, as the overall coordinator for that program, would initiate projects that were more steered towards alternative medicine. So we still kept in line with a lot of the Western tests and notions, but we still always wanted to give people the opportunity to empower themselves through the use of herbs, studying herbs. So we did seminars on how to cook for yourself tastefully if you have high blood pressure or diabetes. Simple things that people could begin to take ownership of, as opposed to feeling victimized by the way these conversations happen. So that is, and then after that, after leading this program for quite some time, I felt like I was, and I hear this a lot, self-trained in herbs. I read every book that there was on herbs. I knew everything that every herb could treat. I knew every symptom that every herb could treat, and that's okay. But I knew, I was 30 years old, and I just had this moment where I felt like I had reached my limitations in terms of what it was I was able to do for our people. So I went to med school, and everybody thought I was a lunatic at 30 years old going to med school. But I went to med school. I got my undergraduate in alternative medicine, and then I went on to go get a second bachelor's in professional Western health sciences, and my master's degree in traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture. So even as a consequence of doing that work and working with people, the question of food sovereignty is intimately linked with the question of food hegemony. And I have been to so many workshops. I've been to conferences at Yale with 3,000 people, and I've been to workshops in the community around this question of food sovereignty. And typically it starts right where we are, acknowledging what the issues are and coming up with practical ways to address the current situation. The approach that I wanted to take with this talk with you all is, one, understanding the historical perspective of how we've gotten to this place, and two, understanding that and understanding what has caused the need for a conversation about food sovereignty in the first place. And it's a loaded question. I've been rewatching documentaries for the last week in preparation for this workshop, trying to narrow what I was going to talk about, because this question to me is one of the primary questions of the day. In the organization that I was affiliated with, I used to have, and I might not, can you guys hear me okay? Unless, for video purposes, do you need this, or do I have to have this? Okay. I feel, whatever. Anyway, so one of the arguments that I used to have with my leadership in this organization was, and I see it a lot, I've done work with a lot of organizations, and there are two primary things that are always seen as something kind of like side notes to revolutionary work, to political action, right? like the real work, right? The real revolutionary work is demonstrations and fighting the power, and I dig it. I've done all of that. Campaigns, and letter writing, and cool. But the question of health and wellness and the question of culture and its impact on people are the things that were always treated like a side note to the quote real work. And to me, it was backwards, and it was a way that we neglected to recall how other organizations over the last 100 years have seen their centrality to the revolutionary movement, right? Like, if you can meet people where they are, where their specific self-interests are, that is the way you woo them to the work, right? That is the way you win them to a more intimate connection to, quote, the real work, right? So you can go back to the turn of the 20th century with the UNIA. For those of you who don't know that organization, that was the Universal Negro Improvement Association, Marcus Garvey's organization. And he had a very simple program. Very simple. He said, look, what is it going to take for us to establish a sovereign nation? We've only been off the plantation 30 plus years. What is it going to take for African people to establish sovereignty, not only here in the United States, but globally? It is going to take our control of our own self-image, our own media, in our own hands. It is going to take security, which included food, clothing, shelter, and protection. It is going to take our control over our economics, our control over our education, and our control over our health. And he said, okay, that's what we got. That's what's going to establish sovereignty for us. And then they went right to work building a program that addressed every single one of those issues. The UNIA was founded in 1914, and by 1916, there was a purported 10 million global members of that organization. There has never been a black organization that has even closely matched the membership, paid membership, to another revolutionary organization. So they understood clearly that these were the things that what represented sovereignty. The Nation of Islam, same thing. The Black Panther Party, which most people can relate to because these were young people who didn't have a blueprint. They were in Oakland, they were like, look, this stuff is messed up, living in the hood. Kids aren't getting food. They can't concentrate in school because they don't have enough food at home to eat breakfast. Let's start with that. Let's go stick up, people try to sugarcoat what the Black Panther Party did. But at the end of the day, the oldest founding member was like 24 years old. And they were parasitic, store owners, shopkeepers in the community. And so they would go to these shopkeepers and say, look, this is an unofficial stick up. You're going to give us this many eggs, this many bread, this much milk, you're going to give us this every month, or we're going to make sure that you don't have a business to run. And so this was the beginning of their free breakfast program, right? The free shoes program, the free food program. And a lot of these, the first sickle cell anemia testing in this country came out of the work of the Black Panther Party. And then, the state hijacks it, stands in front of it, and says, look at what we did for these wonderful, poor, impoverished, inner city Negroes, you see. So that's where this question of security comes in. It's not just enough to provide food, clothing, and shelter. It is to secure the programs that we put on the ground. So with these programs and with the question of food sovereignty, there have been blueprints already laid out about what constitutes the kind of mechanism that's going to ensure that everybody has the human rights of food, clothing, and shelter, right? So, all right. So there are a couple of things I'm just going to lay out, and then we're going to go down the list. The question of food hegemony versus food sovereignty. What is food hegemony? Can somebody tell me what I mean by food hegemony? Guess. Throw something out at me. Tell me.
The limitation of the different types of crops we grow and bringing it down to just a small fraction of the various types that have been grown in the past.
That is a huge part of it. Now, what does hegemony imply? Excuse me.
Bringing it down to a singular point and sort of erasing the diversity.
Yes.
Dominance?
Yes. Wait, say that again?
Dominance or control?
Yes. Yes. Did everybody hear him?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. So you're right and you're right. What you're talking about is the product of what he's talking about. Where you have, say that again?
Can you say it again for those who didn't hear?
Did everybody hear what he said? He said dominance, right? She was talking about the narrowing down of availability of food, right? He was talking about dominance, the hegemony, and both are right. Because what we're looking at, some people have called it like food tradition annihilation. Have you heard this term? No? Okay, so like I said, this is a conversation that's being had in a variety of ways, and all are correct. But I think what the weakness is that they have not come together in a matrix that helps people understand the total picture of what it is we're looking at. So when I talk about food hegemony, we're talking about several mega corporations that have cornered the market literally on all the food available on the damn planet. Primarily through genetic modification of those foods, but not exclusively. So you're looking at corporations obviously like Monsanto, like DuPont, like Dow, what's it called? Synergistic, something to that effect. But these are all companies that have been around for a very long time, almost a little more than 100 years. Monsanto was founded, I think, in 1901. So you have these companies that had nothing to do with food 100 years ago. Typically, these countries were either chemical companies, or they were a part of the war machine. They were companies that were specifically developed to create biological warfare and chemical warfare. These same companies that have cornered the market on the food supply globally are the same companies that have given us PCBs, that have given us phthalates, that have given us what do they call it? Oh my God, Agent Orange. They have given us radioactive isotopes that are used to like knock off heads of state. These are the same companies that control our food. So once you get a bigger picture of the birth of these companies, where they came from and what their bottom line was, the bottom line was typically death and destruction. These are also the same companies, Monsanto in particular, that gave us DDT, which was outlawed in the 70s. It's still produced, by the way, but you know, we raise hell over here because we have a little bit of power. You know, we have a little bit of what we like to call democracy, so we won't allow them to use it here, but they didn't stop producing it just because it was banned here. They still make, sell, and produce DDT to distribute throughout the third world, right? So these companies were in the business of creating ways to reduce the population, to kill human beings, to make people's lives miserable. The damage from Agent Orange in Vietnam can still be felt among the people today. So these are the people that we look to now for food production. And they have cornered the market on food. Right now, the global population relies on about 12 grains and food staples as their primary sources of food. Right? 12. The whole world. So when people start talking about, these people start talking about starvation and, you know, not being able to feed all the people on the planet, overpopulation as it relates to being able to feed everyone, there are some estimates that the food traditions, cultural food traditions that have been destroyed or annihilated through primarily colonialism, colonization was the primary thing that gave rise to the destruction of food traditions, primarily through the displacement of whole populations and what have you. And I'll get into that a little deeper a little later in our health discussion. But so you have food annihilation, supposedly, and then you have these companies propagating all the time. We need to control the population. There are too many people on the damn planet. We're not going to be able to feed anybody. That was the whole basis behind the justification of the Green Revolution in the first place. The Green Revolution began in the 1950s, and it was what gave rise to genetic modification of food, right? Now, it wasn't until the 1960s, during the Clinton administration, where they said, okay, we're going to give you the ability to patent life, which opened up a Pandora's box of a whole host of problems. But they have been working on the Green Revolution and genetic modification since the 1950s, all under the guise that with the population explosion, there was not going to be enough food to feed everybody on the planet, which is a lie, which is a fallacy, but that was what they used to terrorize people into, co-signing on this, on these policies. Now, despite the fact that the majority of the world relies on these primary 12 grains to feed the population, so there's never enough, right? There are more than 30,000 known edible plants that are not being used for food for specifically the disappearing of food traditions. What I mean by that, it's so deep, is because even this concept of poverty and abundance, right? Poverty and wealth. You hear these stats all the time that make you so demoralized. So 71% of the world's population is living off $10 a day. But the problem is that as colonized people, as black, brown, red, and yellow people around the planet, the primary issue was colonization. The secondary issue is that we accepted for ourselves and internalized for ourselves our enemy's definition of abundance, wealth, and poverty. So now our food culture is defined by our inability or our ability to get to a goddamn grocery store. Excuse my French, right? But there is nothing collective anymore. There is nothing social. There is nothing reciprocal about how traditions and cultures emerge in human society in the first place, right? So now we are wholly dependent on those who mean the whole world, not just people of color, the whole world, no good, right? Now we accept for ourselves what they say represents affluence, abundance, wealth, and poverty. And if you don't meet these standards, it means your ass is poor, and it means you're probably starving. Well, what did wealth and abundance look like before colonization? Anybody? What did wealth and abundance look like before colonization? We have some idea.
Biodiversity.
Biodiversity, yes. Somebody else?
Health.
Yes. Optimal health, relatively optimal health. What else?
Connections with people.
Yes, absolutely. More specific. Yes.
The ability to have leisure time.
Yes. Oh my God, yes. Yes. Right? The absence of jails, prisons, old people starving, old people tucked away in nursing homes. Even some of the early scientists, social scientists who talk about, the stages of human development, Marx and Lenin and all of these guys, and they were on the right path. But even they observed these phenomena where? They didn't observe it in Europe. So where did they observe what they were talking about were the key points or the key factors in social and human development? Watching the Iroquois. That's where they saw it. Wow, the people have a good standard of living. Everybody has a house. Everybody eats every day. Everybody's well fed. They look good. Their teeth aren't rotten. Right? They have no diseases. This is what wealth and abundance looks like But in a group of people who come from starvation, poverty, and lack, which was Europe, right? They tell us that, right? That's basic history. We escaped Europe, ran out of there, kicking and screaming to escape what? Religious persecution and feudalism, right? Serfdom, slavery, right? They escaped the most horrifying conditions that exist on the planet Earth at that time to come and see these people living well and abundantly, right? So even though by European standards they may have only been living off $10 a day, what? They didn't have to work 40-hour weeks to get food, clothing, and shelter. They had that, right? Or to go to Africa and have, have Greek and Roman soldiers document the kind of freedom that women were allowed, to be offended by the kind of freedom that women were allowed in matriarchal societies. See? So the question of food sovereignty is really a complex kind of conversation that I feel like sometimes happens very narrowly because we're pitted with our immediate circumstances. People need to eat, people need good quality food, right? People need to have access to fresh fruit and vegetables in these, in these food deserts. And that is an appropriate response. But until we begin to seriously analyze the true nature of our problem, it's like, from a medical perspective, you have two things. You have symptoms and you have disease, right? And a lot of the time, we just treat symptoms. And we treat and treat and treat and treat, and people get sick and sick and sick, and you are on this rat wheel, right, of treating symptoms. But if you get at the heart of any issue, then you have the ability to really come up with long-term solutions to these problems instead of piecemealing what the solutions are, right? Like patchworking. So that's why I wanted to start with the question of food hegemony versus food sovereignty. You cannot have a conversation about food sovereignty unless you come face to face with what the primary issue around the globe is. When you talk about the enormous amount of birth defects in places like Brazil and India, because companies like Monsanto are still forcing monocrops in these areas, or the IMF and the World Bank imposing monocrops on countries that supposedly owe them a debt, and then imposing on them these horribly toxic pesticides and monocrop seeds. And some people, got common sense. Like, I don't know if y'all recall a few years ago, as a matter of fact, y'all were very young, I'm sure. Let's see, what year was that? It might have been 08, where the earthquake happened in Haiti. Mm-hmm. I think it was around 08, so most of y'all were still in high school. But there was this big controversy because the United States, as benevolent as it is, sent tons and tons and tons of GM rice, supposedly to feed the poor Haitians after this crisis. Now, first of all, what they don't say is that the fact that the United States government prevented anybody else from being able to come in and assist Haiti. Mexico offered to help, Cuba offered to help, Bolivia offered to help, and the airports were shut down. Like, the United States, with the aid of the UN, completely blocked anybody else from being able to come in and assist the people of Haiti. They want to come and emerge as the great white hope of Haiti. They bring, I think it was like 3 tons of GM rice to Haiti. The next thing you know, the people burn that shit. They set the whole 3 tons of rice on fire. They're like, we'll starve before we eat this shit. We know what y'all trying to do. You understand what I'm saying? And that has been happening all over the world. Of course, you don't get like big news brought. The same thing happened in Kenya, same thing happened in Ghana, same thing happened in Nigeria. Like, people are saying that we will take our chances on our own before we will accept aid from people who've been trying to kill us all along anyway. Mm-hmm. So that is just one small kind of microcosm of this kind of dynamic around the question of food sovereignty and food hegemony. That you cannot separate the two. That we have to come face. I used to have a professor. He was in his 50s. He was kind of a hippie, and he was my herbs teacher in my program. And he used to say, holy, peaceful guy. Used to go to India every year and stay in a cave for 6 months with his guru. Straight, like, cool dude. But he used to say all the time, if y'all are serious about making a revolution, the first people to go has got to be Monsanto. Like, that's how serious it is. And every president since Ronald Reagan has had both hands, in bed with Monsanto, including Barack Obama, who was key in allowing certain legislation during his administration for Monsanto. So, everything okay? Yeah. Okay. So that's all I wanted to say about that. I can say a lot more on the question of food hegemony and food sovereignty. But when we start talking about, at the end of this, we're supposed to be talking about like actions that we can be taking. I think every action that we take around the question of food sovereignty, whether it's guerrilla gardening, whether it's coming together to do food co-ops, we have to always be charging. We have to always be shining the light on the crimes, literal genocidal crimes of these corporations on the general population, but in particular people of color around the world, colonized people and people of color. To spin off of that, when we talk about food tradition and food tradition annihilation, so all food tradition is, and I wanted to read something to you guys too, all food tradition is the same thing that any tradition is. Tradition, culture emerges from people's social experiences, right? Things that might be otherwise mundane activities, we have a way of making them not so mundane. We create allegories about these activities. We watch the sun and the moon rise and fall, right? We watch the relationship of the plants to the spin of the earth, and we create stories about them. That's what astrology is. That's what the constellations and our stories behind the constellations are. That's what a lot of the old deities and stories about creation come from, is human beings' intimate relationship with the planet, with their surroundings, and coming up with ways to make beautiful these things that happen scientifically. Doesn't make it any less scientific. It's just a poetic way that we talk about it, right? That's why I appreciate the system of medicine. I'm going to talk about this in a minute. The system of medicine that I cut my teeth in, because, I am a pretty left-brain type of person. At least I was. Western science, that's my bag. Total geek, love chemistry. I think it's like the sexiest thing ever. So to go to med school, I knew I didn't want to practice Western medicine. So to go to a medical program that was just as heavy in the Western sciences as it was in what we call the esoteric sciences, or alternative medicine is the cute thing that we call it now, really just opened my eyes to so many of the deficiencies of the way that we learn in the West. One of which is the way that we attempt to demote the scientific value of that which has been given to us by the ancients. We demote it as somehow less scientific because it wasn't analyzed in a white room under a microscope in a lab by a white guy in a white coat, right? Here we have 6,000 to 8,000 years of human observation and why it works. But it's not proven valid until it could be tested, in a laboratory. And so this discussion happens the same way when we're talking about the emergence of culture, the emergence of tradition. Have you ever heard of the saying that necessity is the mother of all invention? Everybody ever heard that? Okay. Necessity is the mother of all invention. You have a problem to solve because it means your ability to eat or not to eat. That's how you come up with these genius ideas about how to figure out how the hell you're going to eat. So, and we hear a lot about it now because we hear, about all of these inventions that white slave owners got credit for. But where was the incentive for them to make labor easier for their slaves? Cotton gin, all of these creations, these inventions created now that we know by enslaved Africans, right? that were patented by their white slave owners, but it was the necessity to lighten our load, to ease our burden, that gave rise to certain inventions. Well, let me read you something really quick before I digress too far. So women, this book, which is awesome, I am really fighting to teach a class just on this book. So my being a scientist, when I first read the title, I was like, oh my God, this sounds like some holy hippie shit that I know I'm not going to be able to get with. Now I'm a spiritualist, but for me, you know, like I have to make it work in my scientific mind. Do you understand? And the great cosmic mother, rediscovering the religions of the earth. I was like, okay, well, let me just read the first chapter. The book is everything. The woman was a genius. The book was published in 1983, I believe. But this woman was like she was in my head. A pure scientist who used the emergence of early religions of goddess worship to explain all of the inventions and the creations that we so give thanks for. And we automatically, both men and women, we automatically assume that it was a man that came up with it. We don't even ask the question, right? Because that's the society that we are acculturated in. And this book is really talking about the transition from primarily matrilineal, matrifocal societies to patriarchal societies and all of the downturns that came as a consequence. She uses archaeology, she uses scientific research, she uses, historical context, archaeological. The woman is a genius. I love the book. And so, I was looking through the book just to find something smallly relevant, because she even has a chapter in here called Marx in the Matriarchy. The book is phenomenal. So, so I was like, okay, well, let me find something specifically around the question of food and women's impact on food over the ages. So if y'all can bear with me, how much time do we have?
It's 7:54.
So, we good?
Yeah, oh, totally.
Okay. So this chapter, I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but I'm going to read quite a bit that comes from it. This chapter is called Women as Culture Creators. When we say that women created most of early human culture, we are not trying to sound radical. The evidence is there, all around us and quite tangible. When we realize how many basic life industries were the inventions of women, cooking, food processing and storage, ceramics, weaving, textiles and design, tanning and dyeing, everything related to fire, chemistry, metallurgy, the medicinal arts, language itself, the first scripts and glyphs, grain domestication, animal domestication, religious imagery and ritual, domestic and sacred architecture, the first calendars and the origins of astronomy, and on, then we don't need to project our imaginations far back into the past to confirm these inventions. It was, Evelyn Reed, an anthropologist, Marxist, and feminist, has written extensively about women's early social forms and inventions. In The Myth of Women's Inferiority and Women's Evolution, Reed describes how human culture developed out of women's labor groups, necessities, interrelations, and first crafts. It was the female of this is a quote. It was the female of the species who had the care and responsibility of feeding, tending, and protecting the young. However, as Marx and Engels have demonstrated, all societies, both past and present, are founded upon labor. So, it was not simply the capacity of women to give birth that played the decisive role, for all females give birth. What was decisive for the human species was the fact that maternity led to labor. It was in the fusion of maternity and labor, that the first human social system was founded. It was women who became the chief producers, the workers and the farmers, the leaders in scientific, intellectual, and cultural life. In the language of primitive peoples, the term mother is identical with producer, procreatrix. She goes on to say, evidence shows that the further back we go in human history, the gentler our species was, contrary to popular belief. This is because the early matrifocal groups were concentrated on maintaining rather than exploiting life. Evelyn Reed shows that during the food gathering epoch, the hunter-gatherers thing, the food gathering epoch, stretching over hundreds of thousands of years, the human group's main nourishment was supplied by the women collectors, who dug the earth for edible roots, plants, and grubs, collected fruit and nuts, and the hunters hunted such small animals as lizards and hares. Large game hunting kept the men away for long periods of time and didn't always bring back enough to eat. Among hunting and gathering people today, the women's food collecting activities provide still 75 to 85% of their group's daily nourishment. This is what we're calling the so-called third world. And Africa and South America are primary examples. Today, as it has always been, the market is run by the women. It is the women who are bartering, who are exchanging, who are harvesting all over the continent. If they live in the rural areas, the women have always run the market in Africa and in South America. And she's saying that outside of this dynamic that has been imposed on us, you know, if the supermarkets, and you see what kind of chaos, even the hint of some kind of weather, destruction causes. The markets are wiped out, people panic, because we cannot even conceive, because of our hopeless dependence on this system, we cannot even conceive of surviving a week without a grocery store being open. We cannot conceive of we don't know what our local plants are that are edible. We don't know how to be out in the woods and understand that we can nourish ourselves for any sufficient period of time if we have a knowledge of the plants that are local to us, right? So that is what creates the crisis, in events that typically don't end up to be crisis situations, right? Just one more thing I wanted to quote from here. Okay. Much of the small game that women hunted and snared was brought back alive to the camp. Sometimes the young of animals killed by the male hunters were captured and brought back alive too. These animals were often kept as pets and provided the first experiments in animal training and domestication, which finally led to stock breeding. Motherless animal young often suckled women's breasts as captured cubs do today among the Ainu in Japan. So even the domestication of animals had its root in women's maternity. Latter, cattle breeding became an extremely male-oriented activity, like so many others, but originally it was a woman's work. Among the ancient Arabs, women not only made and owned the family tents, they also owned the herds. World myths, folk traditions, and anthropological studies agree that women first discovered how to use and produce fire. In a survey of 224 modern tribal societies, it was found that fires were made and tended always or usually exclusively by women in 84 different societies. Almost all these societies have legends telling of early times when women were the exclusive owners of the fire. Ritual maintenance of fire remained entrusted to women down through the historic times, such as the Vestal Virgins of ancient Rome or the Irish nuns of Saint Brigid, originally the Celtic cult of the goddess Brigid or Bride, who tended a perpetual fire at Kildare until the suppression of the monasteries under Henry VIII. Fire is sacred to the Moon Mother. Cooking, boiling, roasting, baking, steaming was only one of the techniques women acquired from their mastery of directed heat. Fire was the tool of tools. Through its use, foods could be dried and conserved for future use, and some poisonous plants and fruits could be made edible. It was women who developed all the early associated industries of cooking and ceramics in which fire was the critical tool. Women built the first granaries and storehouses for provisions. Some of these were sunk into the earth while on marshy ground they were upraised on stilts. Women domesticated the cat specifically to protect the granaries from rodents. Cats, since immemorable time, have had a special relationship with women. Among European witches, cats acted as familiars and were believed to have telepathic powers, which is why they set their asses on fire. I'm paraphrasing. So, anyway, she goes on this. I could really read this whole chapter to you because it's just that awesome. But essentially, she is just talking about how. Okay, let's see. Okay, yeah, and then the next chapter is the first language, which is, what's the first language? Between a woman and her child, right? The first communication. So anyway, it's just, can I have some water? I'm like doing,
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for coming. Oh, thanks. Sorry about that. I know I'm going through a lot very fast, but again, it was a very loaded question, and I wanted to cover a pretty substantial amount of ground. I think this could be a whole, like, 3-day workshop, and it should. Also, I know some of you guys have the zine that was made, and there's some resources in there, but there were some additional things that I wanted to make sure that you at least look up or try to get access to. One, obviously, is this book here, The Great Cosmic Mother. And then the documentaries, excuse me, The Seeds of Death, which is it's a more updated look at Monsanto. So it's more current than The World According to Monsanto, which I think is listed in your zine. But Seeds of Death is like a more updated take on The World According to Monsanto. And then the books, another book is In the Shadow of Slavery. So I'm going to talk about this for a second. The name of the book is In the Shadow of Slavery. The subtitle is Africa's Botanical Legacy in the Atlantic World. In the Shadow of Slavery. Africa's Botanical Legacy in the Atlantic World. The author is Judith Carney. I wanted to mention this very briefly because we talked a little bit about women's impact, historical impact on food tradition and food culture, the emergence of food tradition and food culture, basically out of a necessity and out of this relationship that we have to the earth, right? This daily give and take relationship that we're supposed to have with our surroundings. So when we talk about how food culture has changed in this country, there are some very clear things that we can point to that have changed dramatically and for the worst, the food traditions in this country. Colonization in general, but in particular, the forced removal of indigenous peoples from one place to another. These are places where they evolved, where they emerged, and their food tradition was based on their intimate knowledge and relationship to their immediate surroundings. So to uproot hundreds, if not thousands of people and take them to a whole nother part of the country where they have never been, not only do they have to relearn the terrain that they are in, but potentially thousands of years of food knowledge and traditions, herb knowledge and traditions have been lost or eradicated as a consequence of that. Well, that's not the only thing that transformed food traditions in the Western Hemisphere, dramatically changed food traditions in the Western Hemisphere. The other thing that was a major impact was the transatlantic slave trade. There are estimates of as low as 250 to 500 million Africans that were forcibly displaced over a 250-year period of time from Africa, the interior, Central, and West Africa to the United States. There are some countries that don't have that many people. So you have this forced removal of this massive amount of people to a foreign land, and that in and of itself could change the food tradition. But what greatly impacted the food traditions and the transformation of the food traditions in the Western Hemisphere in general was, again, the women. The women, the women, the women. There are scores of articles coming out now, especially when people are talking about cultural appropriation and does food apply? Hell yes, it applies. Damn it. It's like my pet, like duh, yes, food applies. And so there are all of these discussions happening about food appropriation, whether it really applies to cultural appropriation. So there are these articles coming out now about foods that we thought were indigenous to the Western Hemisphere that were actually transported during the African slave trade. And the way that these women, not knowing where they were going, not knowing what foods were going to be available on the other side of this 3-month boat trip, not knowing if they were going to have enough food on the boat trip, started to hide food, hoard seeds, hoard grains to ensure that they had the ability to plant when they got on the other side. There are whole documentaries on how African women took their children and took their sisters and took their mothers and hid seeds in the braids of their hair, hid rice in the braids of their hair. There is a oh my God, what country is it? I can't even remember. It's a Central American country, but they're saying that this, oh my God, what is the name of the country? I don't have a brain this lap. But anyway, there is a Central American country right now that's predominant, it's like 84% black. And that the coffee and the rice grown in this country is still as pure as it was when it was hid in the women's hair and brought over 300 plus years ago. That they have been able to keep it from being, cross-contaminated with other breeds and other strands of rice and coffee. So okay, so let me just tell you some of the foods that were brought over here that we might think are indigenous and actually are not. So the cola nuts, black-eyed peas, what we call kidney beans, red beans, okra, watermelon, coffee was not indigenous to North or South America. It was brought from what we now call, what we used to call Arabia, the Middle East, and Northern Africa, primarily Northern Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, places like that. Coffee, licorice, several strands of rice, cassava melons, yams and sweet potatoes, lima beans. Peanuts is an interesting one because peanuts were not indigenous to Africa. But this story also gives us some glimpse of the relationship, the pre-colonial relationship between Africans, the indigenous people of the Americas and Asia, because peanuts are actually indigenous to South America. But during the slave trade, they were found all over the continent. They were not indigenous to Africa, but they were found everywhere in Africa, which is a hint of the relationship, the pre-colonial relationships between Africans and brothers and sisters from the Western Hemisphere. So I thought that was interesting. Millet, sesame, and plantains were all non-indigenous foods that were brought, among many others, but these were the main ones that we know of, that were brought from Africa to the Western Hemisphere specifically during the slave trade. So you bring foods that aren't indigenous to a particular area, that too will begin to change the food traditions in a particular area. The last thing I'm going to say about food traditions is again around this relationship to Monsanto, because you can see over the since the 70s, this change in the general health of Americans. There are more, they say 64% of people in this country are considered morbidly obese, which is 25 pounds or more, right? 64%. When I was growing up in Alabama, we used to say two things. It wasn't being funny, it was just an acknowledgement that Asian women, you could never find an Asian woman with acne, ever. At least when I was growing up. And you would never see a fat Mexican. Fat Mexican woman or a fat Mexican man, they did not exist. We didn't see them, ever. And there were a ton of what we call Mexicans, Mexica, brothers and sisters, all throughout the South. So what has happened in 30 years? Their diets are primarily the same. They still hold true to their food tradition. It is not their traditions primarily that have changed. The foundations of their traditions are still the same. Most women still cook in the house. They still, use flour or corn tortillas, right? Their food traditions haven't necessarily changed that radically. What has changed is the nature of the damn food. That is what has changed. So-called soul food that my grandparents grew up on and never had a rotten tooth, never had, diabetes. There was a study that was done, it was an observatory study, but in the turn of the century, in 1904, there was a group of doctors from Johns Hopkins University who were trying to understand why it seemed that Black Americans were immune to diabetes. Okay, that didn't shock anybody. It shocked me when I read it. When you hear now that Black people die more likely than anybody else from complications of diabetes in this country, suffer more amputations from diabetic complications than anybody else in this country, their life expectancy is shortened damn near 20 years for diabetes alone. And 100 years ago, doctors were trying to understand why Black folks didn't have diabetes. So there is a way that we hear statistics, especially as colonized people. We hear statistics, and that shit is used as a way to bludgeon us over the head, have us internalize that there is some inherent weakness in our Blackness, in our brownness, in our redness that makes us predisposed to these diseases, and that our colonial relationship to a parasitic system has nothing to do with it. So I read statistics, I'm a scientist, I acknowledge what is valid in them, but I also know that it is a science that is easily skewed and manipulated, and most of the times it's manipulated in a way to demoralize poor and working class people who feel like they have no control over their health outcome, right? So when you're talking about food traditions, okay, well, what's different about soul food now than when my big mama was a young girl, or, my mom was a young girl, where they didn't have these problems health-wise that all of us seem to have now, and younger and younger and younger, right? And it is the food, and it is the monster in the room that people aren't even equipped to talk about because they don't know how much the food has changed and what kind of impact it's having on us. When you watch Seeds of Death, when you watch The World According to Monsanto, and how they have created laws that prevent companies, that prevent scientists, that prevent researchers from even buying their food to test its safety, to test its safety. Monsanto has approved clauses that prevent researchers from getting access to the food to even test it. Right? So when somebody does say, okay, bump that, I'm going to do my own independent study, and they do these independent studies. One guy was given $3 million to do an independent study on GM corn and the effect that it may have on rats. No, GM potatoes, excuse me. He took 3 potatoes. He took a GM potato, he took an organic potato, and then he took a conventional potato, but sprayed with Roundup Ready. With Roundup, right? So, the GM potato is the one that has Roundup in its genetic material, right? That's the whole basis of GM products, is so that it can withstand being, suffocated with Roundup and any of Monsanto's pesticides. They are quantified as pesticides. The food themselves are pesticides. So you've got the GM potato, the organic potato, and the potato that's conventional but sprayed with Roundup. The GM, and then they took rats from infancy and fed each group the potatoes, and their lifespan is 2 years. So they observed these rats over this 2-year period of time being consistently fed these 3 different types of potatoes. The life expectancy of the GM potato rats, most of them didn't make it past 3 months. When they did, and throughout that 3-month period of time, they developed tumors that were rats that were 17 millimeters in size. Almost a third of their body was consumed with tumors, right? The rats that were eating the potato that was conventionally grown but still had the Roundup on it lived the full 2 years. They still had, a plethora of health conditions, failing organs, a lot of reproductive issues, a ton of reproductive issues and birth defects in offspring. But their life, they still lived, most of them still lived to the 2-year life expectancy. The GM rats, most of them didn't make it past 3 months. And they were consumed with cancer. So when they're talking about even the process of genetic modification, which is complicated, I won't go into that too much, but if you watch the documentaries, they go way into how genetic modification is even done. They're saying that it's not just the content in the food, that it is actually the destruction of the mitochondria, the cellular DNA, that is causing this plethora of health conditions that shortens life expectancy, causes mass obesity, a ton of different cancers. And you think about these rats that look like little mutant rats that have fat deposits everywhere, massively swollen livers that you can actually see their livers protruding out of their little rib cages, right? And then you think about the people that you know in your community who are, quote, poor and just have bad diets. Do they just have bad diets? Right? We have a way of looking at like people with health issues, or specifically the morbidly obese, as if it's just some inherent weak. Just stop eating, right? But we are looking at 50 years of literal toxic waste that not only has changed the entire face of food around the planet, but it has changed the nature of animals that consume the food. That is why they're talking about polar bears with undescended testicles and unable to reproduce, or not being born with any reproductive genitalia at all, or amphibians throughout this country that have suffered as a consequence of the proliferation of genetic modification in the environment. 90% of the cow meat that we consume, chicken meat that we consume, are eating GM crops to fatten them up. Those genetic changes are happening to those animals. The FDA passed a law in 1998. Up until that point, if an animal had obviously had cancer, you had to incinerate the animal. You could not put the animal on the market for human consumption. If you found a tumor on an animal, he had to go to the burn. 1998, they said, okay, well, if you can see the tumor and you can cut it off, you can still sell the meat. This is what we're confronted with when we're talking about food sovereignty. We're not just talking about access to it, we're talking about how they deliberately market this poison to poor and working class people. Why? Is population control like a conspiracy theory? Is it, this is the world that we're living in.